I think about it as liminal space between what was and what will be. And that I'm sort of swimming in that space in a transition. And that
Mhm.
transition has its own sort of energy, but I'm still sort of looking back at what was and sometimes holding on to it and looking forward at what will be and kind of either wondering or expecting or getting excited, who knows?
Mhm.
So it's that liminal space, yeah, in the middle.
Hi, Tanmeet. It has been a few weeks since I have spoken to you.
I'm so happy to be here again.
I know, I am too. I know we were just talking about the fact that we usually text or talk to each other like every day. And the last 4 weeks have been a little nutty, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, it actually is the reason we came up with this idea of talking about transitions today because, the end of the school year, it feels like there's so many things going on, like a lot of life transitions. But yeah, and I feel like I've just jumped right back into all these things for my family. So I'm just like trying to transition from, being in treatment to working and now getting back into like family life. It's been a lot.
Yeah. And actually, when you say that, it actually feels even more potent that transitions, like you even are saying at the end of the school year, and you don't have children in school anymore.
Right. Yeah.
But it is still a seasonal and sort of way that the world works, that we
Yeah.
all kind of go through these transitions of seasons, of
Right.
spring to summer, of nature, of graduations, of endings and beginnings. So that's really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I've really been thinking about that a lot. And so, we really wanted to talk about this idea of transitions and understanding transitions because in Ayurveda, we talk a lot about seasonal transitions, life stage transitions. But then, like we're saying, we were starting to talk about the fact that there's even other transitions that we go through. And how do we sort of transition from one thing to the next? So, I think
Well,
it's a really
and
interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I just want to say this. We didn't talk about this before, but see, now we're in it. So now I know why we're talking about
There
it.
we go.
But I also think it's interesting if you think about how every transition isn't predictable in the sense of how long it will take, right? So we
Mhm.
know about this sort of, oh, spring kind of turns into summer, that kind of transition, or I'm starting a new job. So that's a transition. But when you just mentioned you're transitioning from treatment to now coming back to work and life this year, I
Mhm.
mean, really, if you think about it, we don't know how long that transition will take for you, right? And
Right.
so that really just sort of reminded me in the moment that there's change and then there's change that takes shorter or longer.
Right. And it's like change that has a changing time schedule, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of overwhelming when we're saying it that way, but you know. Okay, so let's talk about, this idea of transitions first. Let's just start there to like kind of to frame this out. How do you look at transitions? And we've already started talking about it, but like how do you think about transitions? Like in general?
Yeah. I kind of think about transitions. I've never had anyone ask me that. And now I'm going to tell you because I just thought about it when you asked me. I think about it as liminal space between what was and what will be. And that I'm sort of swimming in that space in a transition. And that
Mhm.
transition has its own sort of energy, but I'm still sort of looking back at what was and sometimes holding on to it and looking forward at what will be and kind of either wondering or expecting or getting excited, who knows?
Mhm.
So it's that liminal space, yeah, in the middle.
I really like that frame. What the space between what was and what will be.
Mhm.
It's an interesting way to say that. And actually that so kind of encompasses all the different types of transitions we're talking about because it is that space between one season and the next and one life stage and the next and kids coming home or graduating like going from being in school to graduating or coming home to college or going to a job or getting married or having a baby, like all of those, right? There's that space, that time between.
Yes.
Yeah. what was and what will be.
Yeah. And
Mm,
if you think about it, I mean, that transitional, that liminal space, to me at least, feels like it's full of potential. And I
mhm.
think that's where it also can be a space full of anxiety or dread
Yes.
or
Yes.
anticipation. And so that potential can be the potential for energy in many directions, right?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of potential, and that's because everything can change, right? I'm thinking of like a chemical reaction, right? You put things in, and then there's that energy that's built, and if it's enough energy, it explodes or whatever. Like those chemistry experiments we used to do in high school and, grade school,
Yeah.
where we'd
Yeah.
blow things up, right? Because that was showing us that we could combine things to create this energy that could be combustible. But the ingredients that you put in had potential already. So you're
Right.
talking about that potential that exists in that space, and then you move to what will be, and it's like the reaction in a way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And even then, I think, if we can get really granular,
Mhm.
it's what will be is really what can be, right? Because what
Mm.
will be, often we think we know what will be.
Mhm.
So therein lies some of the sort of sense, I think, of unease that people can have in transitions. And I know that when we have talked about it, you and I, in the past, transitions, because I
Mhm.
love hearing the way you encapsulate them in the Ayurvedic frame.
Mhm.
When we talk about transitions, we don't talk about them as necessarily being good or bad or
Right.
being anxiety provoking or
Mhm.
full of ease.
Mhm.
And nor do we even have a goal around that. What we're
Right.
really talking about is the fact that transitions are inevitable
Right.
and that we're always changing and life is always changing.
Right.
And therein lies some of that sort of understanding that how we can accept this moment as it is, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But that's a liminal space that can be
Yeah.
hard to be in sometimes.
Right, and what I'm thinking about is that because it's something that is inevitable, right? Why are we so afraid of it? I mean, if it's part
Mm.
of being human and we see it in nature, which is what Ayurveda says, right? We're observing nature, we're one with nature. We see something as simple as the seasons, right? Going from spring to summer is where we are right now. We see how the animals change their behaviors. We see, the plants and flowers, they start to bud and then all of a sudden they're in full bloom, right? They're transitioning. Yet for whatever reason, we don't see that we should be changing also. We resist it so much. I mean, a lot of us do anyway,
Yeah. I think
right?
most of us, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's some sort of dissonance there between what is spiritual change and this sort of primal need for safety and comfort as well. I mean, I think that we can know that we are going to change and life is going to
Right.
change.
Mhm.
We even want that. We want our children to go to college or
Sure.
to, move out
Yeah.
and have a life that they love, right? I mean, there's
Mhm.
all these kinds of ways that we are hoping for change even.
Right. Right.
But then we have gotten comfortable in whatever space
Mhm.
we're in, and that liminal space, once again,
Right.
is not very comfortable. It's
Yeah.
full of unknown, of
Mhm.
unease, and we're
Mhm.
primarily, I think, wired to think that's a threat, because
Right.
we have gotten into a zone. And I think every growth involves some risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's no different than animals going from one season to the next. They have to sort of redefine their food sources or their shelter or whatever, right? And that's an unknown. I mean, it's animals, but even in like, buds, they're budding, in plants, they're budding, and there's this space of like, will they be able to bloom and grow or will they wither away, right?
Yeah.
Sort of a not knowing, even for nature.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the way that you put it with watching nature change and,
Mhm.
rebirthing and birthing and hibernation and all the ways that nature goes through
Mhm.
these changes makes it feel a little more or a little less threatening, right?
Right.
That if we can look to nature, maybe we can understand that our primal fear might be to resist risk and growth,
Right.
but our primal need is also to cycle through different stages.
Mm.
And so, how can we sit between the need and the risk and understand where to lie in that? So,
Mhm. Ah, so much wisdom. Damn, you're so good. The primal need and the primal risk, the balance between those. That's good. Yeah. To think about that a little. I'm sure that'll come up. But yeah,
I
like, I
know.
mean, so it's really this idea of transitions. And honestly, I don't know that I was as in tune with the changes of the season, even though I live in Chicago and we have 4 seasons and I've grown up here, lived here my whole life and grew up with Ayurveda. But of course, there was that time when I was sort of oblivious to the healing tradition that I had grown up with because I was in Western medicine. And it has taken me some time to get back into that and understanding it. And it's been fascinating for me to look at that and to look at the transitions and all the lessons in Ayurveda about looking at transitions from one season to the next. Just starting at, well, actually, it's even more simple than that. It's the transition from day to night, right? If you just start there on a
Yeah.
daily basis, right? What is that transition and what are the different things that will be going on a daily basis? That's like that circadian rhythm that we talk about a lot, right?
Yeah.
And learning how to sort of lean into that daily transition and sort of be in harmony with that. And I guess that's the whole idea of not resisting it. Like,
Yeah.
when we talk about people staying up all night because we have lights and electricity, we're resisting nature. We're resisting that transition from day to night, from wakefulness to sleeping.
Yeah.
And it's not good for us.
Not good.
Right?
And I think what you're saying is really actually powerful because I always look back at sort of ancestral views of how this might have worked. I mean, imagine when darkness first fell and no one
Yeah.
understood it,
Right.
right? I
Right.
mean, that's so scary. And yet we evolved to understand that circadian day
Hmm.
and night.
Hmm.
And so it gives me a little hope and inspiration that, we can also evolve to understand adulthood and
Right.
aging and,
Right.
so many other transitions that have felt so scary to people. So I like
Right.
when you put it in that sort of very simple day night, it feels like, how could we not understand that change happens? I
Right.
love that.
Right. But it's just human nature and that we are going to resist it, right? With all the technology we have, we resist going to sleep because we're scrolling and we're doing work with electricity or whatever. That's just a simple example. But I mean, that to me is like so basic in the sense of like that is a resistance we deal with every single day on a daily 24-hour cycle of resisting getting up in the morning or going to sleep at night or eating at a certain time or whatever it is, right? We resist those natural cycles that we have internally that are actually in sync with nature because our minds get in the way. We have this to do. We have to go and run all these errands. We have to go pick up the kids. We have to, go to our jobs, see these patients, whatever it is, right? We can make a million excuses to resist the change, being in harmony with nature. We can resist it because we let our minds get in the way.
Yeah, I think you're really touching on something bigger here than maybe people understand.
Mhm.
Because what you're saying, Avanti, is that we resist what is harmonious for us
Mhm.
because of the need to do, the need and the want to produce more or to
Yep.
feel like there's more we can get done
Mhm.
or that we should do.
Mhm.
And you're making me really think in a deeper way about transitions that really, I mean, it seems obvious, but a transition is, like I said, a liminal space for a pause, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, I've never thought of it like that, and now you're actually
Mm.
making me think about it like that. Like, maybe that's why we also resist it a little bit because it requires us, if we want to do it with ease and
Yeah.
smoothness, it
Yeah.
requires us to pause a little and notice and take
Yeah.
note. And I don't know that we're in our modern society always ready to do that. So I
Mhm.
don't what you're saying feels really big to me.
Mm, yeah. Now this is not something we talked about before.
Not at all.
Right? So I
I
have to
almost
think
feel
a
like,
little.
"Oh my gosh, I don't know where we were going with this," but I'm sort of distracted by this whole thought now.
Now I am too. Yeah, that's what it is. It's like nature is saying, take a breath, take a pause before you go from what was to what can be and what will be.
Yes.
Take a moment and readjust, right?
Yeah. I'm overwhelmed with it actually because it
Woo!
feels really big to me. Because when you think about the Ayurvedic framework, especially, what I think we're really missing in modern society is
Mhm.
that understanding that there is actually a space between all these transitions. There we don't just go from
Yeah.
cold winters to hot summers.
Mhm.
We don't just go from the flowers blooming to now, the
Right.
leaves falling off. It's
Right.
a gradual
Yes.
change.
Yeah.
And yet we think that our changes can just be, okay, now I'm going to move into a new job and here we
Right.
are.
Right. Right. Yeah, because we think we don't have to. We think that those rules don't apply to us, or maybe not rules. What I don't know how to say those sort of natural cycles don't apply to us, which is so interesting. So yeah. So okay, we'll come back to this,
Yeah.
the pause thing. But let's just get into sort of the Ayurvedic perspective of transitions, because that's how this whole
Yeah, please.
conversation started, right? And so, like I already said, we in Ayurveda, we think about the transitions just on a daily basis from day to night, night to day. But then we also talk about these seasonal transitions. And then we talk about life stage transitions. We've talked a lot about the daily transitions. I mean, we'll link some of those episodes in the show notes. We've done tons of episodes on circadian rhythm. But let's talk about seasonal, because we haven't done a lot of talking about seasonal. And so, the way that we look at it in Ayurveda is that every season, so winter, spring, summer, fall, has a predominant energy,
Mhm.
one of the doshas, either vata, pitta, or kapha. And one of those energies will predominate during the season. Now, over the course of that season, that predominant energy will accumulate so that at the end of that season, you have all this accumulation of the predominant energy. I'll give an example in a minute. And if you don't take that time to assess, okay, how much of that energy is within me and how much have I eliminated from my mind, body, spirit, you will go into imbalance.
Yeah.
You start going out of balance. And so it's this idea. So for example, we went from spring to summer. We're in that transition right now as this podcast episode is getting released at the beginning of June. We're in that liminal space between spring and summer. And the predominant energy in spring is kapha.
Mhm.
Okay. So that's earth and water. It's that heaviness, that slow stagnation, water, all the qualities of water and earth. That has accumulated over spring. And now we have to transition to the pitta energy of summer, which is the fire energy, right? Because of that accumulation, if we don't eliminate and let go of what each of us needs or doesn't need, right? If we don't let go of that, we will start to have all kinds of symptoms that will show up because it's an imbalance. And so, this idea of transitioning is so important, is that you need to adjust some things to help eliminate the accumulated energy. So that's like sort of where we go with the whole seasonal transition.
Yeah. I mean, it's a metaphor for everything, right? But
Correct.
I'll
Yeah.
let you
Yeah.
finish.
Yeah, it is. So we'll get to the metaphor. And then the other one, let's talk about this one, is life stage, right? So
Mhm.
really we're talking about sort of three life stages in Ayurveda. It's really four, but it's easier to understand as three. And it's childhood, adulthood, and wisdomhood. And I mean, again, these are just general guidelines just to make it easier to think about. But like basically, 0 years to 25 years is childhood, 25 to 50 is adulthood, 50 and beyond is wisdomhood, right? And each of those life stages, again, also has a predominant energy that will accumulate over that time period. So childhood is all kapha because kapha is earth and water, it's structure, lubrication, we're having growth. That's what childhood is about. Then we get to adulthood, which is all about pitta, it's
Mhm.
fire, right? You need that fire to do all the things that you're doing in the world, whether it's child rearing, family rearing, career rearing, whatever you are doing in the world, you need that fire, that energy.
Yeah, literally. Yeah.
Literally. We're both in that, like, whoa. And then you get to wisdomhood, right? 50 and beyond, which is when you transition to the vata period of life, which is more air and space. It's right, sort of that time of more introspection, clarity, thoughtfulness, all, you go into that time of sort of retreating a little bit. So there's a dominant energy again. And again, we see this in medicine. Like the best example that I can think of is menopause for women,
Yeah.
right? When we're going from the fire time of life, that middle time of adulthood, 25 to 50, going into wisdomhood, we have all this accumulated fire, which is why we have all these menopausal symptoms. They
Mhm.
all are because of fire. And so it's like we need to figure out how to eliminate. And that's why some of us have more symptoms than others. Like me and you might have different reactions to that accumulated fire because you may have accumulated more. I may have gotten rid of more. And so
Mhm.
my symptoms aren't quite as, intense as yours are. Right. So that's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but that shows you sort of that idea of accumulated energy from one life stage to the next, you know? But then I think what we were talking a lot about was the transitions from, one time to another in sort of these markings of human existence, of like birth and death and pregnancy and getting married, going, graduating, going from elementary school to high school to college, college to, graduate school, whatever it is, onto a job. Those are all transitions. Yet it's so interesting because we're not prepared for them,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. I think we're not only not prepared, but when you think about the framework that you just presented about accumulated energy and
Hmm.
imbalance,
Yeah.
I think there's also a way that we don't understand that transitions are very individual. And so
Mhm.
I think much of the suffering comes up with not thinking that my transition should look like yours. And so why isn't it as easy for me to mother my newborn? Why
Mm.
isn't it as easy for me to change jobs? Why isn't it as easy for me to go into my 50s? And on
Right.
and on. And
Sure.
if you think about it, it's because we're also in a very standard, rigid Western approach of the transition from what was to what will be should look the same for everyone when it never, ever does.
Right. And then we don't talk about all the different ways that it can present. It's always this ideal that we're looking at, that this ideal picture of what pregnancy is or what birthing is or motherhood is, whatever it is, right? There's all these sort of ideal pictures that are presented to us that we're inundated by. And so then we compare ourselves to that as well. And we don't talk about all the different ways that those transitions can show up for us.
Yes. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, I delivered babies for 20 years, and I can't tell you
Mhm.
how many times in that first postpartum visit with a new mom, how many times I actually found out that they weren't doing as well as they thought they should be doing, merely
Mm.
because I would introduce the concept that this is a really hard time. And many mothers can feel down and lost and
Mhm.
stressed. And
Mhm.
then the mother would break down and say, "Oh my God, it's not just me." And
Right.
what, and I feel like I can't talk about it because everyone's just talking about how happy I should
Yep.
be.
Right.
And so it's this way that, and I'm not even counting all the people with clinical postpartum depression.
Mhm.
I'm just talking about this transition from
Right.
being a woman who doesn't have children to one who does. And,
Mhm.
this ideal that we build up, we don't prepare people for how hard it can be.
Mhm.
And then we all can have a little suffering around that.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, we'll get to this because I think the question is, well, how can we start to approach these transitions from an Ayurvedic standpoint, going from one season to the next? We're using three areas of remedy that we always talk about on this podcast, right? It's like the routines, the lifestyle practices that we do every day. It's the diet that we take in, our physical food, but also the food that comes from all of our life, right? Our relationships, our career, passions, work, our environment, our lifestyle and routines, all of those things contribute to the food that we take in and the diet that we have. And then the tools of yoga, right? What do we do to help regulate our nervous systems, shift into parasympathetic so that we can actually deal with everything that's coming at us all day long, right? So those are sort of the ways that we really lean into self-correcting
Mhm.
as we go through each season, right? And we can sort of apply that to sort of these other transitions that we're talking about, but I think we'll make it a little simpler to understand. We talked about this, but before we get there, let me just talk about, because I've been getting tons of questions. I even got a couple of messages today on Instagram asking when we were going to talk about summer seasonal transition. So we'll
Mm,
talk about that really
yeah.
quickly, about some of the, the basics of going from spring to summer. Again, it's that accumulated kapha that we want to release, right? And so what are some of the things that we can do? We really want to, let's talk about routines. The first thing is that we're going into the pitta time of year. So we really want to do things that help us regulate our temperature and cool off. So things like, using natural ingredients and foods that are cooling, right? For either for our self-care or that we're taking internally. So that means, juicy fruits and vegetables. It's really what nature is providing, right?
Yeah,
You look to
yeah,
nature,
exactly,
right? Whatever is
exactly.
abundant in nature, that's in season. That's what we should sort of be eating, taking in through our mouths, putting on our skin, etc. And then really looking at how can we sort of regulate our temperature by not doing tons of things in the middle of the day when it's the hottest time of the day. So if you're going to be exercising or getting outdoors, which you should be, obviously, absolutely get out into nature. Do it early in the morning, do it later in the evening when the sun is not quite as intense so that you can regulate your temperature, because you don't want to accumulate more fire so that at the end of summer you are a hot excuse the pun, a hot mess because you
Right,
have so much
right.
fire accumulated in you, right? So it's really these things that you're going to do to cool off. So again, and I have a lot of blogs on my website that, go into specifics about that. But that's just like a general way to think about it, is that you want
Yeah.
to cool off and lighten up a little bit.
Literally, and cooling, breathing exercises, etcetera. And I think what you're saying about eat what's abundant and in season is really, I mean, take your cues from nature, right?
Right.
And it's the same way that it's better to water your garden in the early morning or the evening, not in the heat
Yeah.
of the day. Like it's
Love
the
it.
same thing, right?
Mhm, mhm.
So it really, this coming back over and over to what happens around me in nature.
Yeah, absolutely. We all, if we have pets, we get them a shorter haircut. Like it's sort of like, lighten up the types of fabrics that you're wearing, right? Natural, organic fabrics as much as you can, but you're doing lighter cottons and linens and things like that. Lighter colors, maybe brighter colors, right? You take your cues from nature. I
Yeah.
mean, nature is like blooming with beautiful colors. Wear those colors. It really does add to your health and wellness from an Ayurvedic standpoint. So
Yeah.
just take your cues from nature. But okay, let's get back to the topic that I mean, I just touched on it and I'll do another episode. And actually, I think I have a couple of episodes on summer
You do.
transitions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll make sure that I link those in the show notes. But let's get back to this idea of, how do we approach transitions and this change, the kinds of transitions we're talking about, maybe more life stage or the sort of experiences that we all go through as humans, birth, death, all those things we were talking about. What are some ways that we can kind of prepare and manage for those transitions? You had some really great ideas on this.
Well, I think the first step that we were thinking about, which I think we touched on in the very beginning of this
Mhm.
episode, which is just accepting first, accepting impermanence, accepting change as
Mhm.
inevitable.
Yeah.
And I would say not only inevitable, but useful
Mhm.
and welcome, that we don't want to be stagnant. We don't want to get stuck in only being one way our whole life. We want to
Mhm.
have change.
Mhm.
And, understanding that and accepting that is actually the first step to embracing a
Mhm.
transition. It sounds so simple. It is, but it's not easy. It's just
Right.
simple. And so the question is, looking for yourself, if you're listening to this and you're in any kind of transition, which most of the time we are,
Mhm.
am I actually accepting it as an inevitable and useful time, or am I resisting it? I think that would
Right.
be the first
Yeah.
crux right there.
Yeah, and I love what you just said about looking at the change as opposed to being stagnant and stuck. Like, I think there's something really powerful there because, you know, we don't want to be stuck. Being stuck is like you can't move. You're not growing. You're not going in either direction, in any direction, right? You're just kind of stuck there. Who wants to be stuck? So I really like that idea of actually looking at it as not a scary thing, but a really exciting thing, something that can help us is the change rather than the opposite, which would be just, kind of being stuck in the same place. Really
Yeah.
like that idea. I think that's a really good frame or reframe actually to think
Yeah.
about.
I mean, and I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about uncertainty a lot.
Mhm.
And I really think there's a way that we don't trust ourselves in a very unconscious, subconscious way. It's like we don't think we'll be able to handle it, quote unquote, or we won't make it through, quote unquote.
Mhm.
But the truth is, we've come through change over change over change our whole life. I mean, nothing is permanent, and we
Mhm.
have changed through so many things.
Mhm.
And so I really think it's also about coming back and trusting in ourselves that I
Mhm.
have done this. It might not be this exact
Right.
transition, but I have done this,
Yeah.
and I can do this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you really think about it, like back to that daily cycle, right? I also always say that, in Ayurveda, we're constantly going in and out of quote balance all day long. It's happening all day long because the only time that you are in perfect balance of what your doshas are, what your prakriti, your genetic blueprint was when you were born and then when you die, right?
Yeah.
So every other moment that you're alive, you're going in and out of balance. So you're changing all day long, right? So
Yeah.
you really can handle this. You really can. It's a
Yeah.
different type of change. And maybe it's a little more conscious. You're more consciously aware. And that's where our minds get in the way because those little changes that are happening all day long, we may or may not be conscious of that. So it just happens. But
Yeah.
I think, again, what you're saying is that if you could actually think about the fact that you do this all the time, that you have done this all the time, that you'll be okay. There's a lot of power in that,
Yeah.
right?
And I mean, if I think about it, we haven't talked about this, but I'm going to just ask you because I just thought about it.
Mm.
That, you're in a major transition coming back from
Yeah.
treatment, from a year of
Mhm.
treatment. And I wonder, I mean, there have to be ways I'm imagining that you've come back and there's change that is on the welcome end and change that is harder to accept. Would that be, I mean, you don't have to even
Yeah.
go into detail. I would just
Yeah.
imagine that's true.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm happy to share. I mean, some of the things that I've really been thinking about. Actually, I think about it every day, and I've had discussions with my therapist about it. But I think some of the changes that are sort of those welcome changes, but I have to work hard at it. Like I have to be aware, is that I don't want to go back to sort of showing up in the world and being in my work the way that I used to, which was 24/7, always thinking about it, not taking breaks. Like that was just not healthy, right? And here I am trying to teach people how to be healthy and I wasn't being healthy. So that is like a welcome change for me.
Okay.
But I'll tell you what's been not a welcome change for me, it's been difficult, is to also sort of reset my expectations of myself, which is to say, I'm not going to be what I was before in the sense of I have a new normal, sort of. And I need to sort of recalibrate to that because the body that I was in a year ago, year and a half ago, is not the body I'm in now. So whether it is because I've had a double mastectomy and it's quite visual, right? That way, or it's because I've had so much muscle atrophy from just not being able to do anything, right? So feeling like, oh my gosh, my body is not capable of doing what it was doing a year and a half ago. That has been a really hard change for me to deal with. A transition, that is like a really hard transition for me. I'm having a hard time with that for sure.
Okay, this is a huge transition. We could have a whole podcast episode on this. But I guess no, it's really powerful, and I
Mhm.
wonder just as an example, what is a way that you cultivate acceptance through that transition? I know that not every one of
Yeah.
us is going through the same transition, but
Mhm.
many of us are resisting who we are in the transition, what we
Mhm.
have lost in the past.
Right. Right. I think, honestly, it didn't click for me until I was sitting with an endocrinologist at the beginning of the year who is a physician, obviously, and works with a lot of oncology patients, specifically breast cancer survivors. And I was sitting and talking to her about all of this, and she just sat there and she just said to me, and I know I've heard this from other people, but she said, Avanti, you're being really hard on yourself. You physically are a different person than you were a year ago. And I don't know what it was about the way she said it to me, but it suddenly clicked. And I was like, oh, yeah, I am. Physically, I am a different person. So why can't I give myself some grace and some space to sort of get to know that person that I am now rather than continually thinking about the person I was and comparing all the time to the person I was or the person I think I should be. It's sort of that idea of what you were talking about, right? And I think what she was also inviting me to do was to actually create a new normal. She said, "How about you create a new normal for yourself?" Because I was like, I just want to get back to normal. I just want to get back to normal. That's what I was saying to her. And she said, okay, let's create a new normal. And I was like,
Yeah.
shit, she's right. And that's that pause that we were talking about earlier. It's like,
Mm,
take a pause and create a new normal for yourself. It's okay.
mm.
That
It's
was
yeah.
transformative for me. It really was. It helped me so much.
I mean, it sounds like you had sort of a lightning bolt of
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness to the moment
Yeah.
along with self-compassion, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that feels like it's so relevant for so many of us in even
Mm-hmm.
different situations in terms of losing loved ones and it being
Yeah.
not the same life anymore,
Right.
or going to new jobs, or our children moving out and going to school or leaving the house.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's just so many ways that I think we can be who we were.
Right.
We've lost something,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's time for us to find who we are now.
Right. Yeah. And I actually think that this actually even happens when we like receive news of anything. So what I'm
Mm,
thinking about is like, we get a diagnosis or we get some bad news or we get some good news, right? There's that change that's happening right there. And it's again resetting our new normal to the information we just got. It could be just like a micro change. It doesn't have to be something as big as what I was talking about, that's very, very sort of obvious and like visually obvious, right? But it could be something so small. Like you get the news that, like you said, a loved one passed away. What do you do with that?
mhm.
Right? Can you create a new normal in the sense of, and this doesn't mean you go back to business as usual, not that kind of new normal, but sort of, can you allow yourself to be in a new place that you have never been in before or weren't in before?
Yeah. Or to understand that your grief and your present sadness and suffering around this loss is going to transmute that place of where you were to where
Right.
you are, right? That
Yeah.
knowing that that's almost the alchemy right there is the
Right.
sadness has its own purpose, right? And just be
Mhm.
with it. It
Mhm.
sounds like you were just in that moment really with where you are.
Mhm. Yeah, I really did take a pause, and actually, it's interesting as we're saying this because for me that pause actually was getting on a plane and going to India. I
Mm.
actually talked to you about this, I
Yeah.
think, is
Yeah.
that for me, going to India for 3 weeks was, yes, a year of yes. I can say all those fun things like, it's my year of yes. But what it was, and I didn't even realize what it was until after, and now I'm reframing it in this way that we're talking about it, is that it was a pause for me to have some space to go from one place to the next, to transition from treatment to post treatment. I didn't realize that that's what I was doing when I decided to go to India because it was just creating a different environment for me, some different routines, being around different people, having a different perspective, all of those things when you travel. And for me, going to India after 5 years was that really felt like what it was. And I just came back feeling different. Even though
Mm.
I have my ups and downs every day of like, oh, I'm having this ache, I'm having that pain, like things that I never had to deal with before. But I just fundamentally have had that space to transition from what was to what will be, what can be. So for me, it was like that trip.
That's so
Hmm.
interesting because I think that, that encompasses this first step we're talking about just accepting that change is here, that
Yeah.
it is here and
Right.
it is happening. And then really it speaks to the second step we talked about, which is to create intention around the
Yeah.
transition.
Hmm.
So you don't have to go to India
Right.
or,
Of
take
course.
a big trip, but
Yeah.
what you did unknowingly maybe, but now you
Mhm.
recognize is you
Mhm.
created an intention
Right.
that I need some space
Hmm.
to embrace and live this change, to
Right.
pause and notice
Right.
where I am going.
Yeah.
And so, this second idea of creating intention, think about now how that changes you for future changes, for future
Mhm.
transitions. I
Mhm.
bet just recognizing what you did with that trip will help you mark an intention in the future around a big transition, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. And it's so interesting because we do this in small ways in Western society, right? We have a graduation ceremony, we have a baby shower, we have a wedding, whatever, a wedding shower, all these things, which are beautiful ways to mark the transition. But I think what is missing many times is that it's more about the celebration or the event that marks it rather than the intention.
Mm,
I feel like sometimes that is a piece that is missing, and that can be hard for people because they feel like they had this thing but they're still not ready
yeah.
for that transition. I don't know how to explain it. Like you were telling me about the way that you marked the transition of having your children. Can you
Yeah.
share that
Yeah.
with us?
Yeah, I mean, this was a practice introduced to me by a mutual friend of ours,
Mhm.
and it's called a blessing way, which it comes from indigenous practices. And it was a way, instead of a baby shower, it was a way to bring community and specifically your female motherhood community. And that doesn't
Mhm.
mean everyone has to be a mother, but just this sort of idea about bringing women and
Mhm.
understanding how we birth things and ideas and people into the world.
Right.
And so we created a circle. Everyone brought a very special stone or, gem or some object
Mhm.
and gave me a blessing on it and
Mhm.
gave me a blessing for me as a mother and for my child and I. and then we beaded them on a necklace. And then
Mhm,
that necklace was something I wore when I gave birth to my children. Two times I had a necklace, one time a bracelet, but I wore this
mhm,
piece of jewelry and I still have them. And I do my own personal blessing on them every year on that child's birthday. They don't know that, but I do
mhm,
do that.
mhm,
And it was such a special, not only a way of marking it beautifully and bringing community together, but it
mhm.
was this way of creating an intention that, oh, wait, I'm about to become a
Right,
mother.
right.
This is quite sacred. And
Mhm,
even, for all three of my children, it was, I'm about to be a mother to two children.
mhm.
I'm about to have a third child. What does
Right,
that mean for me and my
right,
family?
right. Because
And
that's a
so,
transition too, not just even having another baby, but going from 1 to 2, 2 to 3,
right.
right?
What does that mean for my partner? What does that
Yeah.
mean for me? And each time it really allowed me to settle into the pause, like we were saying about
Mhm.
transitions,
Yeah.
and to be with it in a way that felt really sacred and out of the ordinary, because no
Mhm.
transition is ordinary. We are moving from what was to what can be. And
Right.
that space is sacred no matter what is happening,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I really like this. You know what I'm thinking about also is even on a micro level, like when we talk about having daily routines, like having a nighttime routine, that is marking a transition, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're creating, it might be the same thing you're doing every day, and that's fine, but you're also taking yourself from the day to the evening to sleep, right? So you're like transitioning again, and you're doing whatever. You're having a cup of tea, or you're journaling, or you're doing a prayer, whatever it is. You're marking it with an intention.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what sets it apart from being just a routine or a habit.
Yeah.
And I actually wrote about this last week in my Substack. I call them micro rituals in a way that
Hmm.
they're all, they may seem so small that you may not feel like you can ascribe the word ritual to them.
Right.
But I disagree. I think
Right.
that the more intention you bring to that ritual, as micro as it is, the more it marks this movement between different spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I'm thinking about now is that that is such a important way to regulate our nervous system on a daily basis. But then, even in this transition time, these big things we were talking about, me going from, treatment to post treatment, I created that time for my nervous system to settle in a little bit, something
Mhm, mhm.
from where I was to where I'm going, right? And you do the same thing. Like, I mean, right? When
Yeah,
you were having your babies and you were
yeah,
doing a blessing way, that was a time for you to sort of settle in and
yeah.
transition from one thing to the next.
And
I
I
never
think
thought
about
about
this
that.
in the
Yeah.
workplace, because I think about it as, all three times when I went back to work after
Mhm.
having my babies and being in a workplace where many women had babies and came back, I always felt like we're missing something because
Right.
the first day back, I would come back
Yeah.
and it was such an abrupt, harsh transition
Yep.
and really could have been softened by somebody just taking a moment to honor that I've just been through. And
Yeah.
I don't mean just me, we should have done this for all the women
Right.
who had
Sure.
babies. How do we not have a micro ritual around that? Like welcoming someone back and honoring that they've created life while they've been
Right.
gone. And
Right.
that now they're creating this space to come back to us as a new person. I mean, there are ways that we could soften the blow of our ridiculous maternal leave policies. I'm
Right.
not saying they solve it, but
Right.
there are things that we do not think about or understand as ways to
Right.
be inclusive.
Right, right. And it's again comes back to this idea of, you know, really understanding that we all go through these transitions, and how do we support each other through those, right? And mark them and ritualize them, and again create that space, because what you're talking about is that it's like business as usual. There was no time to actually take a moment to acknowledge that, because we're so worried about being productive, and
Yeah.
doing, right? So let's just jump right back into, our rounds and see all the patients, and there we go, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about the third thing, because this actually goes along with the second. So the first was accepting, the first step is sort of accepting impermanence. The second was creating intention and marking it. And the third was harnessing community. That's what we wanted to talk about. Tell me about what you think about this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think change is scary no matter how you look at it, even when we welcome it. And so, I mean, taking this example of a mother coming back to work, that's scary. Who's taking care of my baby? How will I function? How will I breast pump? That's what I was trying to figure out between
Right.
patients. It's
Yeah.
stressful.
Yeah.
And it takes community to allow us to not only regulate our nervous system, but to be supported through that challenge and to
Mhm.
know that we are not alone. It actually, the connection of community helps set that vagal tone to remind us that we are held and safe and in somebody else's mind and heart
Mhm.
as well. And so I think that example we just used of how we do not welcome mothers back to the workplace is a place where we are
Right.
lacking community and
Right.
connection. But there are other ways, if you think about it, I have a very good friend going through a divorce right now. It's quite brutal and painful.
Mhm.
And there's no ritual of community around a divorce. We all come together for the
Mm.
wedding. And then when it falls apart, even 25 years later, as this one, then we all maybe you hear about it, or if you're her good friend, but we don't have a way of community coming together to support her through it. I've been thinking about this a lot.
Mm.
And so there are just some ways that we have lost that sense that none of us were meant to do this alone.
Right.
I ever. We were
Right.
never meant to heal alone.
Right.
And so the idea of transitions being fostered and held in community, I think
Right.
is not something that's been studied in a randomized controlled trial, but I think we do know the value in
Yeah.
trials from community for longevity
Right.
and for health span
Mhm.
and for well being.
Right.
So why wouldn't we want to harness that during a
Right.
transition?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. Two things I'm thinking about is that sort of these events that we think of negatively, that we think are negative, but are just a fact of life. Death is one
Mhm.
of them. In Western culture, we don't want to talk about it. We just don't want to go there. We'll celebrate it at a funeral, but before it happens, during that transition time, when someone is transitioning from health and being alive to dying, we don't want to talk about it, right? We're missing so much there, right? And that
Yeah.
community. But even your example of, someone going through a divorce, why is it that we're not like marking that transition, but not only just marking it, but like talking about it and being in it, right? I
Yeah.
that's an interesting one. But then if you look at the sort of quote positive way, right? With having a baby, right? We'll have this baby shower and the celebration, but what about that transition, that true transition from maybe not having a child to now having a child, or maybe going from one child to children, right? That space that in many, indigenous cultures, including our own that we come from, South Asia, there is a huge piece of community that happens of support in that transition time. Like for example, when we have babies as South Asian women, our mothers and our aunts and our sisters, they all come and they take care of us, and they're feeding us this, that, and the other to
And they
help
make
with.
certain foods even.
Yes, exactly. That to help us, have our milk come in, to nourish us, to rebuild our tissues, right? They're doing all these things to help us in that transition time. That is not the norm in Western culture to have that. I mean, it used to be, but in modern society, it's not. We just like, have a baby and then we move on,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or someone dies and we have a funeral and then we move on. Like, let's
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, which part of it? There's so
I
much
don't know.
there.
I mean, that it's just something that has always bothered me about these like how we do this. And it's, again, I'm not trying to, sort of, criticize our way of marking transitions, but I feel like we mark the transitions, but then we forget about the actual transition and the support we need during the transition.
Yeah, I mean, it's making me think that what are the structures or frameworks, the scaffolding that could be in place so that that would
Mhm.
be easier, because you don't want it to fall on the person in the
Right.
middle of the transition,
Sure.
that it's the onus on them to ask for
Mhm.
community to come to them. I
Right.
do think that's a possibility. I'm not saying we
Right.
maybe in the transition from not having the scaffolding to having
Yeah.
the scaffolding,
Right.
we should maybe all be asking for more help as well. I think that's a
Right.
valid tool.
Mhm.
But what I would hope and wish for is the scaffolding to be in place so that, honestly, I'm thinking about my friend right now and thinking about how, oh, maybe I could have reached out to her community and said, let's come together, and we don't even have to have something we have to do. Let's just all pick a day for the next month that we go and visit. Like,
Yeah.
how is it that we cannot leave her unsupported,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't even have to be a meal train all the time
Right.
or a thing to do. It can
Right.
just be a drop by.
Mhm.
And so our daily life isn't set up for that to be a sort of natural inclination. But I think that, like I'm thinking about that's something I'm going to change for myself.
Yeah.
What if we set that up? I can't stop by every day, but we can
Mhm.
as a community do that for a
Mhm.
while, right?
Yeah, and you know what I'm thinking about is that, I don't know, my grandfather just popped into my head. He at the end of his life, the last 10 years or whatever, he had this habit, or I mean this ritual that he did every day. He would go around the neighborhood and hang out with his friends or have chai with somebody. And, it strikes me that that ability to connect in that way with people in your community was an opportunity to support people through transitions, because then you heard about them, you talked about them, right? And
Yes.
you gave advice and thoughts and shared, you know, someone's tears or someone's laughter, right? We don't do that anymore, most of us, right? In
Right.
daily life, it's harder to do because of the modern world. Again, that productivity and doing a bazillion things. How many times do we have that opportunity to just sit down with someone, like walk over to someone's house and sit down with them and have a cup of tea and just talk?
Yeah. So it's making me think that the pause is not only individual, but it's communal.
Yeah. And how can we start to create some structures in society? But let's even just start with ourselves. Like, how could we start to create some structures in our own lives to have that space,
Yeah.
right? To have that pause. So, whether it's like saying, you have a weekly family dinner or a weekly family meal or a weekly family walk in the park, whatever it is, right? That space, that like sort of almost ritualizing it and creating that touchstone. We've talked about this too.
Yes.
It's like for nervous system regulation, we create these touchstones throughout the day to help settle our nervous system. Well, if we could do that, you know, as a space once a week or once every couple of days, whatever you can do, creating some structure as a touchstone of a time where you can share and have that pause for whatever transition you're going through.
Yes.
How would that change how we look at transitions and changes?
There would be more space for them to happen.
Yeah.
There wouldn't be as much pressure on them, right?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
part of what transitions it feels hard is that they have to, like we said, happen in a certain amount of time.
Right.
I need to get over it, or I need to get, adjusted. And maybe there's just too much pressure on the transition to occur.
Yeah. Yeah, this pause thing is a
Yeah.
something I'm gonna be thinking about. I feel like we kinda hit on something, the pause, right?
Yeah.
From
Yeah.
one
I'm still thinking
transition.
about it.
I know. We're both sitting here thinking about
Everyone
it.
can listen to us in real time, like having a moment epiphany.
Exactly. You can see all the light bulbs going off in our heads. Yeah, we'll talk about it again. But I mean, I feel like, I don't know that we're gonna come to some, magical conclusion there. But I think that sort of this idea is an interesting thread to think about, that pause, communal and individual. What is the
Yeah.
pause you can create in that liminal space between what was and what is going to be, what can be, what will be, right?
Yes. And even if a transition feels difficult,
Mhm.
maybe it's just a reminder that maybe what you need for a moment of ease in the middle of that difficulty is a pause.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Hmm. Really like that. Okay, so let me just tie up the loose
Yeah.
ends, what we talked about, and like really this idea of transitions, right? And how do you deal with transitions? We talked about Ayurvedic principles of transition, accumulating energy at the end of the season, end of a life stage, et cetera. And then how do you transition to the next season, life stage, et cetera. But then the three steps that we kind of offered as a way to prepare and manage transitions and change is number one, accept the impermanence, that nothing is permanent. Number two, create an intention, right? And mark the transition with an intention, a ritual, personal practice. And then third is harnessing community and really inviting your community into that transition time. And I feel like those are really, they're big concepts. They're not as simple as we've kind of simplified them to, but I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
I've learned so much about transitions in
I
this
know.
conversation.
I know. I feel like I'm going to think about this a lot. This happens every time we do our
I know, but
episodes
it's
together.
helpful
Yeah.
to really work it out together because we
Mhm.
both have these lived experiences and other kinds of perspectives, and when we bring them together, I always find something that lights a
Yeah.
bulb.
Yeah. So I hope that's happened for the listeners. I think this pause thing, it's a really big one. So we'll keep thinking
Yeah.
about that. I hope that all of you guys who are listening will really think about this idea of the pause and how that can help you with a transition, and really think about, what can I do for that pause? And if you have ideas, share them with us. We're both on
Yeah.
Instagram, me and Tanmeet. Our handles are in the show notes. We're also going to link all of the different episodes we kind of mentioned, as well as Tanmeet's Substack. You guys really, if you have not subscribed to her Substack, you really should. I think it is some of the most beautiful writing that I have read. And I'm, of course,
Mm.
biased, but I'm also just, I love your writing. But it's not only beautiful, but it's so insightful and it's really helpful. So I would encourage all of you who are listening to subscribe. But yeah, send us a note, through our websites, through Instagram, about what you thought about this and what you're
Yeah.
thinking about with this pause. Cause I think we're going to think about this and maybe talk
Yeah,
about
and
it
I'd
again.
love to hear ways that people work with transition so that we can think about those practices too.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, then me,
All
thank
right, my
you.
friend. It
Thank
was
you.
wonderful as always.
As always, I love talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank
We'll
you.
be back again soon.